Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have you all here. It's a great pleasure to have Rajiv with us. He is from Aarhus University, leading the section for entrepreneurship for different faculties there, actually. And the topic today is about problem-based approach, open innovation. And just for the ones who take photos and pictures, we will record the session. So we have a full hybrid version here today. You see two laptops. That's why you need two laptops for a full hybrid. As it is hybrid, yes, you need two laptops. It's clear. And so we will record everything. Hopefully this works out this time. And Rajiv will guide us through the afternoon. For the program, you all find the program on the table. So for those of you who have not printed it out, we will have a first intro section. We will have a coffee break. You will work afterwards, after you've got a coffee boost. And in the end, we have also the chance to exchange. We will have an apéro for the ones who would like to join. You are happily invited to do so. To discuss probably about the day, maybe about other things, what are of interest for the NTNs. So it's a day for us, basically, thanks to InnoSwiss. So thank you very much, Angelina, to make that happen, that we have the chance to do so. We all know for the to engage people in open innovation, it's quite a tough thing, or we all went through this exercise and this experience last year. And when we did trainings in summer schools last year, we came across this methodology on a problem-based approach. And at least we, for our NTN, figured out last year that we were running into a trap for the open innovation. And the trap was, we were calling for projects. And if you call for projects, everyone is used to that system, or so what you do as a scientist, you submit a project proposal. And what is a project proposal? It covers a solution. So you right away ask for solutions. And once people, and especially scientists, come up with a solution, it's of course their solution. No? And as they are great scientists, it's a unique solution without any dispute. So what do you need open innovation for? Because it's already done. You don't need to discuss anymore. And that was the big trap. So we used a system which people are used to. Or we call for project proposals, and we ended up with solutions, and we were lacking any discussion. We were lacking the open innovation part. We were lacking the discovery of new things. And last year we came across this methodology in summer school to do a similar thing for entrepreneurship. So you ask multiple students to work together and to come up with solutions later on. But first, they had to figure out what should we actually think about? What is actually the request for solution? And so they first needed to define the problems. And we all, based on our education, we are trained to jump to solutions. We are always asked for solutions. And you know also from management, you should not use the terminology problem. You always should call it challenge, solution, but not problem. So the word problem and the problem thinking was basically wiped out. And now we have to re-emphasize, we have to restart again with that. At least that's something what we think could work. And that's why we are here today. So today we'll talk about problems. It's not a esoterical thing that we touch and feel each other and ask what is your problem. That is not the point. We want to learn this methodology to better understand how to cope with that and hopefully come up with new set of ideas for the future, disruptive ideas. That's what not only InnoSwiss is asking us. I think that's also a challenge for Switzerland to come up with disruptive new things, not with me too things. That's not the point. So we need to have these other types of ideas, and the question is how to get there. And maybe this is a way to get to these ideas. So that's just the general introduction. We have set up these working tables. And in the beginning, I do apologize for moving you around, but if numbers change continuously and we have to get to 4 people at one table, so you have to rearrange, but we are all flexible enough to do so. And it's also good to have mixed tables so that you're not working with your colleagues, because those faces you know already. And it's also to show you how our future attendees will feel like, or they will be also different, coming from different areas, and they have to learn to work together. You want to make them working with this method. So you have this heterogeneous audience, and this is also what multidisciplinary is about. Or it's not about all people from all the disciplines. They are coming from different disciplines, like you are coming as well. So you're in the position of our future participants now. You're going through the same thing. That's basically what will happen to you today. No? Okay, so with this, I'm handing over to Rajiv. Rajiv, the floor is yours, and we're looking forward to learning about problems.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Rajiv. I'm coming from Aarhus University, based in Denmark. I'm originally from India, but I've been working in Denmark for the last almost 20 years. Especially, I have a natural science background, so I have a PhD in biophysics, but I'm quite interdisciplinary myself. I have, after I finished my biophysics, I worked for a couple of years as a postdoc at nanoscience. And then from nanoscience, I moved to the business faculty, and then I worked, I did my MBA first, and after the MBA, I actually ended up doing research there in the Department of Organizational Psychology. And after I finished that, I moved to the humanities department, where we studied philosophy of science. And then there, I worked with understanding entrepreneurship, but from a more humanitarian perspective. So that was what I did. And then I was the head of open innovation for a couple of years at the Center for Entrepreneurship. And then the science faculty wanted me to come back to sort of train scientists and engineers within our faculty about entrepreneurship. So I brought this holistic approach, and I've been doing that for the last 8 years or so. And it was in those couple of interactions, especially during COVID, that I had the pleasure to interact with both Peter and Lucas, and then of course ran the summer schools. Now you've got this, so that's just a small introduction. I do highlight I have another logo here, and that's because I have 2 hats. One is my academic hat, and the other is my academic entrepreneur hat. And I call it as an academic entrepreneur because this is a company that I founded essentially because a problem that I faced, which I wanted to solve, and I couldn't find others to solve, I had to create this to solve the problem. And that was essentially of how to make learning more engaging, but also how to make, I would say, complex learning more engaging. And that for me was sort of the trigger to start this company as well. So this is also part of it, and you sort of see some of the gamification. So one of the other things that I have spent my last 7 years also is on developing games and gamification processes to basically help systems. So, and that's always about a process, right? If there's something that you're struggling with, then you can evaluate whether games or gamification, and these are 2 different things, are sort of the right tool in that context. But again, I also realized when doing that, when I ask myself the question, I shouldn't say, let's use a game or let's use gamification to solve a problem. Let's find out what the problem is. And if a game is the right fit for that problem, then you will use it, but maybe it doesn't have to be, right? So that's kind of the thinking that you need to sort of have. And that's why we sort of realize that we need to focus on the problem much more than we like to do. And as Peter already told you, it's something that is inherent in our training. And it doesn't matter whether I meet a person at an expert level, so professor, associate professor, or I meet a bachelor student or a master student. It's our training that leads us to think about solutions. And in many ways, it's also okay because it's a very exciting place to be in. Problems, a lot of people think it's kind of boring. I mean, just tell us what the problem is and we want to go ahead. And students, for example, just to give my personal experience working with students, is especially the first part of ours. So if I'm running a course in the semester, it's almost half of the semester I spend on just trying to figure out what the problem is. And they hate it. They just hate it because they're like, why are we spending so much time on the problem? We should be spending more time on the solution. But that's why I realized that we have to figure out ways on how we try and hold people back a little bit, right? So it's almost like, I'm not saying you should not solve problems. I'm not saying you should not ideate and you should not come up with solutions. You should do that, but only after you've done the preparatory part well enough to establish a good foundation so that you can then come up with good ideas, right? So that's really the focus. So I'll do a little bit of a theoretical introduction. I know in the program it says that there's one coffee break, but I think we can have multiple coffee breaks, so that's okay. So, and the way we're going to do this is we do this theoretical sort of context lecture. The point here is just to give you context. I did do this lecture early in February as well for the network, so maybe some of you who have heard that might have heard it already, but if you haven't, it's still good for you to get this context. But even if you have heard it, I think it's good to remind yourself because we're going to be using some of those contexts in the workshop later. With that, I'll sort of get going with this kind of problem that I like to highlight, right? So this is a problem that's a global, well-known problem, and it's about malaria. And I can still even ask you this question, right? We still have a lot of sort of malarial deaths that still even involve children under 5. If you think the speed at which we have come up with a vaccine for COVID, for example, why haven't we done the same for malaria? It's been there for so long, right? We keep hearing it, and it's still not gone, right? I mean, these number of deaths are still quite high. So when you look at this kind of data, and then you sort of think about how to go about it, right? And these are kind of the different options that people try and go about it, right? So they do that, like if you were tasked with solving malaria, right? So I give you sort of a second to think about this. What would you do, right? How would you go? Would you eliminate the mosquito? Yeah, a pest. So we should just get rid of it. Would you make the mosquito irrelevant? Would you vaccinate humans? Would you increase preventive efforts like bed nets, for example? Clean up the water sources, so disrupt the breeding grounds of the mosquito? And then, or you would say, okay, it's not it's too tough of a problem. I mean, the world hasn't solved it yet, so how can I solve this? Or it's not my problem because I do something else other people should look into, right? So these are the common sort of responses that you have. So if I ask you to think a little bit here, what would you sort of go at, right? So let's just get a raise of hands for this, right? How many of you here would try and eliminate the mosquito? And you can, of course, have multiple options. You don't have to have only one option. So you can raise your hand for every option you think is relevant. So how many of you would try to eliminate the mosquito altogether? Okay. How many of you would try to make the mosquito irrelevant? More hands. How many of you would vaccinate the humans? Okay. How many of you would increase preventive efforts like bed nets? How many of you would clean up the water sources around? Okay, quite a few. And how many of you would give up already? Okay, one or two of the thinking about. And how many of you would say it's not my problem and others should look into it? Be honest. Okay, so you can see I sort of see quite a few hands for vaccinating the humans. I saw quite a few hands for cleaning up the water sources, and a few hands for both eliminating the mosquito and making the mosquito irrelevant, and also very few actually for preventive efforts. And we'll come back to this again when we see why this is sort of an issue and how this works, right? So we look at least what one company is doing in this regard. Okay, so I like to then highlight another sort of thing here. So what do you see when I show you this image or set of images? Anyone? Just volunteer to say, what is it you think you see? Yeah.
Solutions.
You see solutions, okay?
Same solutions.
Solutions, okay. Maybe you want to elaborate. What solutions do you see?
The second looks like to kill mosquitoes. Or
To kill mosquitoes. Okay.
but then to kill mosquitoes. Huh?
It's always like I primed your brain, right? Because I showed you mosquito slide earlier.
Yeah. I thought it's
Yeah. Any other?
First one is to avoid the back like falling.
Falling, yeah.
Second one is for to avoid having tomato sauce everywhere.
Everywhere. Okay. Yes.
And third one is perhaps against mosquitoes. I don't know.
Against mosquitoes, yeah. But it's like a wristband with digital information in a way. Okay, so what you normally see is interesting that you all said it's the first thing you see when you see an image like this is the solution, right? But if you really think back, the solution exists because there's a problem behind, right? And this solution wouldn't exist if it wasn't solving the problem. Now, I know we're going to be talking about also going to disruptive solutions. This is not a disruptive solution, but it is a solution that solves a very annoying problem of having tomato sauce all over the place, which you don't want, right? This one, if you think about it, the solution is quite simple to the problem that was shown, and that is that the bag slips off, and because of that, and because there will always be weight, it will always slip off. The simple solution here was to create a notch on the furniture so that we can hook the bag onto it, right? So it's a simple way to sort of do it. This is again because patient journals can be sometimes very hefty, and you have to access it all the time. So by making it as in the wristband, which is all normally used for only identifying. So normally you get a wristband in a hospital just with your name, and so now you can actually put much more information on the wristband itself to sort of solve the problem of not getting the patient ID right, for example. So now all of this sort of highlights that it's that we want to sort of get back into problems, right? So I have this title slide. It's the problem stupid, and the reason I have that is actually it was Peter who gave the nice title, but it's the original guy who actually is known to have figured out this and propelled him to the elections is practically Bill Clinton. And when he came into power, and actually it was his political advisor who actually did it, but it's the economy stupid. And then we sort of saying, when you want to put a focus on that, we sort of try and tell that, right? So you see people talking about the business model or the customer or all those follow-ups. So the whole idea is that, when you add this word stupid, it's not to say that you are stupid, right? But the idea is that it's so obvious that we don't look into it, right? It's that is what the focus is, right? And there's a paper that's actually published in Nature Biotechnology. It's called "It's the Problem Stupid" as well. So it's not an original title as well for my sake. But yeah, I was actually looking for it, and I thought, well, this was a cool original title. But it's always good to do your homework. And then you find out that this is from Tillman's personal experience, who's a serial entrepreneur, and he learns that the world's most exciting, groundbreaking technology is pointless if it's unable to address an urgent and relevant need. Right? In entrepreneurship theory, we call this the unmet need, which you probably have also heard of. And what is interesting is it's two words, right? It uses need and unmet, and the idea is unmet is something that doesn't exist before. But also the other critical, I think, part is the word need, because need basically means that, I think we see a lot of solutions out there today that are not necessarily solving needs. They may be solving wants, but not needs, right? Because so you need to consider that how needy is a particular aspect. So, and this is relevant because we love chasing ideas, and ideas are useful for a society, and especially an innovation society. You all represent different innovation groups. Your job is to help people come up with ideas, right? As I understand. So, and that means that this kind of figure of trying to chase ideas is actually quite important, and I think it is important. But there is a small problem with this, right? Is that more than catching ideas, which is of course a good thing, But once you catch ideas, we get into some traps. One of these traps is called, what I call the pushing the idea, right? And pushing the idea means because you get so attached to that idea, you will actually try and push it just because you came up with it, for example, right? If it's up a hill, it's even better. And we see this also for entrepreneurs, right? Because it's the challenge that we see, oh, we are pushing this idea up the hill, there's resistance. And we like to glorify resistance. We like to think, oh, this is not working, that's why we need to do this. We are exhilarated by the effort we take at pushing up this idea up the hill. And whatever this hill could be, convincing your stakeholders, convincing your customers, or bureaucratic, let's say, bottlenecks that you are trying to overcome, and you get very excited by the fact that you overcome those things. And when you, of course, get this idea up this hill of challenge, then you like to congratulate yourselves for the effort. You say, oh, I really did a good job here. But then you like it even more if your peers congratulate you, right? So and there's nothing wrong in this, but the problem is this can lead to the bias of creating a false attachment to the solution that you actually may not even be the right solution to start with, right? But you are so committed to it, and in economic theory, we actually have a well-known bias for it. It's known as sunk cost theory, right? Or sunk cost bias. And sunk cost bias, and this is something that I'll also cover later on when I show you an open innovation game that I created. It was very interesting because when you put something, and a cost doesn't always have to be monetary. A cost can be time, effort, resources, everything that you put into it. And because you've already thrown so much effort into it, you are almost biased by chasing that idea and putting even more resources to it, even if it's actually a bad idea, right? So this is why this is sort of the risk that you get, right? So now, like I said, at the basis, it's okay to love problem solving, right? But you have to be careful that you don't sort of get caught on by the solution that you're coming up with. So that's why I sort of introduced this concept that we should fall in love with the problem, but not the solution. So I would rather be that you are, if we use sort of the, let's say, if I use an analogy here from the marital world, then you would say you should be quite monogamous with the problem, polygamous with the solution. Right? So the idea being there is that you really think about different solutions at a later point, but you want to focus on the problem so much that you don't let go of the problem, even if it's actually, even if it's wrong. Right? So this is really the part of it. So, and then we have this idea that if I have an idea, is that equal to innovation, right? So, and again, running after, I use ideas, and sometimes people like to call them butterflies, but we are sometimes missing the elephant in the room, that the idea is everything. But the idea is not everything if you don't see it in a complex picture that it actually forms, right? Because the idea that you're coming up with generally is probably a part of an ecosystem that you haven't yet understood, right? And that's why you need to be able to see what problem, what unmet need are you actually tackling. And then you could say, it may be even a huge problem or a specific problem, but then you can say, I'm actually solving this particular part of the problem right here. And if I do this, can you, my collaborator, solve the other part, right? And this way you can actually solve the challenge of this unmet need. So I come back to sort of this, why this is again important, because it is the problem really, right? It's really the problem that we need to put our focus back on. Our lenses need to come back to this problem. And entrepreneurs, and especially what I call the really useful entrepreneurs, they like to do this in a very open way. So you can see this. When you have ordinary versus entrepreneurial individuals, this is what you see with ordinary people. And this is again from theoretical observations that academics have made. And they found that, for example, a lot of ordinary individuals, they have this, they tend to live with loads of problems because the automatic responses is just too bad, right? If something is not working, the automatic response would be, this is just the way it is. Or, I don't know why, but and it's not my problem, that's part of it, right? You also tend to be alienated towards changing the world because you are not sort of, let's say, you don't care enough, right? So the point is you don't care enough. And then the other approach that you have is you jump to simple or known solutions immediately, and then you ask standard questions and accept standard answers, or you just jump to action. That means, which happens quite often, which is, this is the problem, let's try and solve the solution. Let's come up with a solution, let's try and solve it without really thinking what the problem is at first. And if you really look at entrepreneurial individuals, now I have to put a disclaimer here, not every entrepreneur is entrepreneurial, not thoughtful, nor ethical, right? Or necessarily problem-centric. But the entrepreneurs that really make a huge difference, they tend to be this, right? They experience the same problems. They hold on to these problems with intense focus on facts and details until they can actually see what is wrong and what is really the problem. And how could we be doing things instead? That's really what they focus on. Now, when we look at this, and I'm going to show you an example now of how an entrepreneur, for example, or a group of entrepreneurs and scientists came together to try and solve, for example, the malaria problem. But I want you to, when you listen to this video, I want you to pay focus to what they did with the problem, how did they approach the problem, and how did they sort of come up with a solution after that. Right? Let's see if I can get this to go. I hope the sound works. And can you hear it in the back?
3 years ago, our team made up of scientists, designers, and public health experts set out to
Sorry, I think it's a bit low on the volume. Let me just... I see the volume bar. Yeah. That should be good, so then I can control it from here.
Our team made up of scientists, designers, and public health experts set out to re-engineer how we protect people from mosquitoes and mosquito-borne diseases. For more than half of the world's population, primarily in Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America, effective mosquito control means the difference between life and death. Despite continued international efforts, a child dies from malaria every minute of every day. Other mosquito-borne diseases, such as dengue fever and West Nile virus, are expanding into new areas, specifically in the Americas.
We protect ourselves by spraying ourselves with toxic chemicals, using small devices to carry around that help repel mosquitoes. In Africa, the technology we're using is no better. In fact, up until this point, we've relied on technology that has existed for years and years and years. And that is as simple as a bed net hung over a bed when a child or a mother or a grandfather is asleep. We also know that that's not comprehensive and that's not fully effective.
We have reimagined the problem and deconstructed existing methods to protect humans from mosquitoes, and it boils down to that mosquitoes track human beings by smelling the carbon dioxide in our breath from up to over a football field away, and then as they get closer, they use their short-range sensors to track us down. We've actually engineered a technology that will disrupt the mosquitoes' ability to track us through their sense of smell. The original technology received grants from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, as well as the National Institutes of Health, which gave a huge boost in research and product development for kite.
The science and the approach all are leading to a new level, kind of a paradigm shift, if you will, in how we protect humans from mosquitoes.
Our drive to get this to market comes from us knowing that if we can successfully distribute kite around the world, we can help in the global fight against mosquito-borne diseases. The first phase of our scientific development is complete. Our active ingredients work in the lab. And now we're asking for your help. We need $75,000 to take the first batch of kites to manufacture and to deploy them in the toughest proving ground there is, Uganda, where in some regions over 60% of children have malaria. In the 6-month pilot, we will utilize feedback and user experiences to help finalize our product, the manufacturing process, and make it available to the people who need it the most.
Okay, so you can see that they really decided to go after the problem of not eliminating the mosquito, but making the human invisible to the mosquito, right? And if you think about it, that required some thought. I mean, if you think about the brainstorming processes these people would have gone through to be able to go to that, like how would you think of that, right? Because the natural response is always, can we engineer better chemicals to kill the mosquito? Can we, can we do all the other things, right, that we normally sort of focus on? And this group tried this kind of a different approach. Now, this is, of course, a slightly old video. Did the approach work? Unfortunately not. In reality, the product works excellent in the lab, but failed in the real world, right? Which we also hear a lot of cases of that. But that's mainly, and that's part of it because it's about the sensitivity of the solution, and also with the fact that they wanted to make it. They are solving another problem. Like one problem is making you invisible, but the other problem is how to deploy it in a low-cost manner. It was also about low cost. So they came up with this idea of easily printable stickers that you could just stick on your cloth. And again, the concept is good, but it failed in the real world because they didn't realize there's multiple types of textiles you need to consider. The stickers would fall off, they won't stick. And if you made it too strong, it could damage the textile. I mean, nobody wants a sticker that would damage your cloth when you take it off, for example. So, and all of these things, for example, have contributed, and they have had to try and rethink the solution. But they still believe in the problem. That is, we want to make ourselves invisible to the mosquito. They haven't given up that, but they're changing the modality of the solutions, right? And that's really what I wanted to highlight here. So another example that I'd like to put and close to you guys is this kind of guy that I call a historical history maker, and this was of course Einstein, and I actually view him as a very entrepreneurial scientist. And the reason I sort of do this is because he wasn't just a brilliant scientist, right? I mean, we have lots of brilliant scientists, but what made Einstein different from most others is that he was what I call a historical history maker, right? Which is a concept by philosophers Spinoza, Flores, and Dreyfus. And what is interesting is that he's, of course, most famous for, at least you might have heard this quote, right? That if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about solutions. And you can see this. I did investigate that as well and did find out that actually you don't really know that Einstein said this. However, apparently it's a quote from an unnamed Yale professor quoted in a 1966 book, and Einstein was not in Yale. But in that, the hour was split into 40 versus 20 minutes. But Einstein, in an article which we have, it's by Einstein in 1938, he did say that understanding the problem has long been considered as the fundamental task in solving it. So it's not to say that, of course, Einstein did believe, so it doesn't have to be, this kind of idea of 55 minutes the same way, but, you sort of understand that you would spend up to 2/3 of an hour, right, of effort in understanding the problem before trying to solve it. So, but again, let's look at also how he came up with his theory of relativity and a simple equation. And I just covered this very, very briefly, but I won't spend too much time on it. But what you see is that there was what we call a pre-Einsteinian worldview, and that worldview was based on the field of classical mechanics, right, which was based on famous scientists like Newton and others, and Maxwell, and successfully used to solve many scientific and engineering problems. Right, we wouldn't have trains if we wouldn't have Newton, for example, right? So, how Einstein is a historical history maker is because he looked at classical mechanics, which is essentially Newton talking about, that how do you describe the speed of any object? Depends on the state of motion of the person who is observing it. And then you have Maxwell, who then predicted that the speed of light in a vacuum is a constant, and experiments prove that the speed of light is true regardless of the state of the motion of the observer. So you can see that these two, both theory and proven theory experiments, were sort of anti to each other. And Einstein really sort of thought that this is an anomaly. And it's an anomaly because if Maxwell's theory is to be consistent with classical mechanics, the speed of light out would depend on the speed of observer, but while many experiments were devised to detect such a dependence, none was ever found. So people tried and tried and tried, but they couldn't do it. right? So Einstein realized that either Newton or Maxwell, one of them had to be wrong, and so he tried to sort of spend more time in solving the anomaly. And what he did is he doesn't give up, so he's really stuck to the problem. The problem is eating up his head. Like, he's really bothered about it. And he figured out the problem was not Maxwell's theory, but it was classical mechanics that was wrong. And that's something that has worked for 200 years. The classical mechanics do not work at the speed of light. And when Einstein first proposed this, the academic world completely resisted the idea. They said, no, you can't question this, right? And but he was a theoretician at that time. It's been proven after many times. But basically, what Einstein was able to do was he had a deep sense of the past. That means you need to know the past, Newton and Maxwell, all the works, and used to make history without being bound to it. That history is always right? So therefore, you become a historical history maker, right? So you create history without being bound to the history that you know, right? So, but you need to be knowledgeable about it. And this is very essential when you talk about problems. You need to know the background of the problem, the context of the problem, where it's working, why the problem is there, what are the existing tools that are trying to solve the problem, and why is the problem not solved. You need to map all of this first before you then spend time coming up with an idea, right? And that's how we sort of get into this approach. So just reminding that 2/3 part of it, right? And again, this is what entrepreneurs do, because they don't just live with the problem, they experience it and hold on. And this holding on is very critical, because if you don't hold on to the problem, what will happen is, as soon as something else, goes, you'll just quickly jump to that. And we see that a lot in a project-oriented mindset. If one project doesn't work, let's drop it, let's move to the other, right? And the thing is, you can create multiple projects which are solution-based, but you should still be focused on the core problem that you're trying to solve. So, so that's one aspect. And the other aspect is what I call the problem attachment problem. And that is this kind of, how do you create this attachment to the problem, right? Why should people care about the problem? And this example, I will just put this with this tin can, which was patented in 1810, but then a tin can opener was patented in 1858, right? So there's a 50-year gap between someone coming up with a can opener to someone actually opening the can, right? So, so if you think about it, why is there a 50-year gap in here, right? Any ideas? Okay, cans were not widespread. Not in 1810, yes, but by 1830s they were, because the wars were over. The cans started to enter the marketplace. It still doesn't explain at least a 20-year gap between that.
People didn't need to preserve food.
People didn't need to preserve food. Okay, I haven't heard that one. I thought always people need to preserve food. Yeah. Well, it's some way or the other. I mean, people use traditional methods, of course, for preserving. But the can was supposed to sort of, give you this kind of huge lifetime. But if you think about what problem is this solving? What is the solution for?
Maybe the can was possible to open the can liquidly before.
Yeah, I mean, if you exclude pull-out tabs that we see for cans these days, which is of course an innovation in that space, has the act of opening a can changed drastically from the 1800s to today, if you think about it? Not really. I mean, we have slightly better tools, but the idea has always been the same, right? Make a hole, cut it around, and remove this kind of cover. So that hasn't changed, the action. And cans used to be very thick before, now they're much thinner. So it's easier to cut through. The metal is thinner. In this time, it wasn't. Maybe that gives you a clue.
Like this kind of thing, and
Yeah.
they would just do it with the tools that they have.
Yeah, so you had a knife and a hammer, that's what you used to use, and then you used the knife to cut around. And again, that was because soldiers did that. And that was part of it. But again, if you really think about it, the problem that you were trying to solve it's not just opening the can. So if I ask you to define the problem is not just opening the can. The real definition is opening the can safely without spilling any content. That is the real definition of the problem, right? And then you would say, okay, to do that, what do I need to do, right? So it has to be safe. It should not spill. When you cut, the edges should be smooth. And if you put all of that, your thinking suddenly is different, right? You're going to come up with different solutions. And the person who came up with this solution probably was very attached to this problem, had probably cut his fingers quite a few number of times, had probably spilled the can on his clothes, that he had to realize, why isn't there a better way? Right? And that's what you have to figure out, right? Why isn't there a better way? And that's really part of it. And the other part is also what you mentioned, is about the instructions. So when we are given instructions to solve a problem, we tend to take that as a code and we say, okay, that's the instruction. And we don't question it further. And that's another problem as well, right? Because, and this especially applies to when we work with protocols. And protocols are very useful. But what is a protocol for? A protocol is designed so that you can reproduce exactly the same result that you wanted. That's why we have protocols. Standardization, which is useful. But if you want something new, probably following the protocol is not useful. Right? So that's really what you have to consider. And again, why do we really love solutions? Is also because of the way we think, and the way we think comes, and the way we train people, and the way scientific method has developed over the last century. And it's actually got to do with this guy, Cartesian, René Descartes, who came up with this Cartesian logic, right? French philosopher, mathematician, and writer. Very useful. He came up with the Cartesian robots, very useful technology. But he also came up with the idea that you have to be detached to whatever you're studying. It's what we call academic detachment. And academic detachment is very useful. Why? Because it leads to objectivity. Because you can't be objective. That was the whole point. Science is always supposed to be objective, right? The problem is that if you use this kind of objectivity to solve a problem, you become very detached to the problem. And that's where we want to draw a line, is that you want to be objective, but you want to be attached to the problem, right? So that's really what you need to consider. And this is, again, it was used in modulism theory, for example. And the idea here is always about optimization. There's no really new opportunities, you're just optimizing for solutions. So this was one end, right? So this is one spectrum. If you go to the next end, then we have what is known as the postmodern practice. And this is this just do it movement. And the just do it movement is about, let's not think, let's just do it. It's all about action, 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 but no thinking. And that's as dangerous because that leads to the other extreme, which is anything goes without thinking, which creates, like, the solutions that you come up with this approach can sometimes be actually worsening the problem that you actually have, right? So that's why you need to consider that these are two opposing thought processes, and really what you need to be is somewhere in the middle, right? It's thoughtful action. So, so for this, we use multiple tools, and that's where I get to this introduction of that you need to map the problem space, and you need to consider what the problem space sort of is, and how do you do that? And these are the tools we're going to be working with in the next hour. So we take a short break before we will cover, sort of get into these tools. But the idea is that we use this kind of problem tree, which is a problem structuring heuristic. And heuristic is essentially, you know, it's I think I have it here, or I'll define it. But the idea is that it's not necessarily a method, but it's sort of a thinking approach that you need to consider. And that is actually, this element here can fit into sort of this phase of what I call problem space mapping. So this study was done by Wall, Fuller, and Huffer in 2022, where they looked at crowdsourcing in COVID time and how text mining as a technology can actually be useful to understand the problem of COVID-19, right? So, and that was interesting because they used this kind of phases before they even came up with a solution. You spend a sort of a 5-phase approach, where you use the first phase to gather information. Now this becomes very relevant if you're working with both open innovation or working with crowds, because if you want to do crowdsourcing, information gathering step is very important. So the size of the circle gives you an idea of the amount of effort that you also need to put in and the time that you need to put in. So you need to spend a lot of time in this information gathering to get the context. Then you need to pre-structure this information that you have gathered. But remember, these are not solutions. You're just looking at what is known about the problem at this space. Then you map the problem, and this can be useful where you then do the problem tree, and then you try and map the problem. And then you try and explore the problem as well, what we call problem space exploration, and we will do that as well. And that's sort of the problem tree method of how you create multiple trees, for example. And from there, you will then get this problem understanding for the solution search. So where you have then understood is this the real opportunity that we have? And this is where you sort of create what is known as an opportunity statement. So this is at least the logic behind it. Now, I'm guessing most of you here are familiar with the design thinking process, so I will not spend time on it. But the idea is that you have all this, discover, define, develop, deliver kind of approach. And normally people think that the problem tree sits just before the problem definition space, where you need to sort of come up with the problem definition. That's where you do the problem tree. It's actually not here. You actually have to do it much earlier when you're still getting insight into the problem, when you're exploring the problem. So it's actually a divergent thinking tool. It's not a convergent thinking tool. Right? So for convergent thinking, you will need to use other tools to sort of eliminate ideas. So just remember, when you are in divergent approaches, it's always about creating choice. When you are converging, it's about limiting choice, right? Eliminating options. So this is really what you need to consider. Okay, so in summary, really attach yourself to the problem, so fall in love with the problem, not the solution. Spend time understanding the problem, even if our instincts or training wants us to rush towards solution or ideas. An 80-20 approach or a 70-30 approach is what I would recommend when you want to refocus your energies and understanding the problem and coming up with thoughtful solutions. And map the problem space comprehensively, because a thorough understanding of how to solve a problem requires what we call a comprehensive analysis of the problem, of the composition, and I love the German word Gestalt of the problem, because it really came from the school and probably much more close to where you guys here are. It's what they call the Gestalt is defined as organized wholes. It's a very systemic approach to understanding something where you understand the sum of its parts. So remember the elephant in the room? So that's really what Gestalt was trying to do, was understand what's the elephant in the room and not just the parts of the elephant. Right? So yeah, and if you really think about it, these guys in the Gestalt psychologists, as we call them, they were some of the first ones in the academic world who actually stressed the importance of problem understanding in problem-solving activities, so spending time in solving problems. So I will end with an example of a sustainable champion that I think, again, questions how we define materials, but also with the solutions that they have come up with. If you think about it, it actually required some rethinking of the problem as well. This is the material Zoa that they came up with, and it's essentially re-engineering of cellulose. But what they're using is they're actually growing this in the lab, but then they're using traditional tanning processes so that whatever you come up with, you can actually easily go and replace the simple tanning industry. So they actually wanted to keep the same processes. If you think about the problem, it wasn't just the problem of waste reduction, which was one of the huge ones they started off with. There was too much waste in animal product, and when trying to do that, they realized why not grow something like that. So that's how they ended up here. And we now hear many more different alternative leather products today, but these guys were already on it from 2013 onwards. So they were one of the first movers in this space. And I think their growth has been slow and steady. Last I heard, so when I first saw this Zoa material, this was in 2014. That time they had just gotten Series A funding of 40 million. Last I heard, they have now had about $200 million of funding again. So they are really doing quite well and developing. And I think they're working with a lot of industrial designers and famous designers to sort of get it out there. So yeah. Okay, so these are my emails if you need to be in touch with me. And you can contact me with either of these. And feel free to. So I think with that, we will take a short break, and then what I would suggest is we get back on the tables, maybe spend a couple of minutes just introducing yourselves if you don't know each other, and then I will explain the exercise. So 5 minutes break, and then